A lamp flickered inside the tent. The old man sat alone, a blank scroll spread before him, and his hand did not move. Outside, the desert wind pushed against the fabric, and the night was heavy with silence. Moses was about to write the first words of Genesis, but he had not been there. He had not seen the light divide from the dark. He had not walked in the garden. He had not heard God call to Adam in the cool of the day. So how does a man write the creation of the world when he never saw it? That question has broken faith before. It has been whispered in universities and across dinner tables to make people doubt. But in the next few minutes, 3 things will come to light. The first is a revelation that no other prophet ever received. Second is a chain of memory that survived centuries, because men refused to let it die. The third is a secret hidden in the clay tablets themselves. By the end, you will see that Moses did not write Genesis by accident. He wrote it because 3 pillars held him up, o manuscrito impossível. Here is the problem in its rawest form. Genesis contains 50 chapters and 1,533 verses. It begins before the earth had form. It covers the Garden of Eden, the fall of man, the flood that covered the mountains, the tower that fell, and the private conversations between God and Abraham when no other pair of ears could hear. It names rivers that no longer flow the same way, minerals buried under the ground, the anguish of Rachel in childbirth, the envy of Joseph's brothers and the tears. Joseph wept in secret, and yet the tradition says one man wrote it all. Moses, born 1526 before Christ. He lived in a time when Abraham was already an ancient name, when the flood was thousands of years in the past. No human witness survived to tell him what happened at the beginning. Not one. Pense nisso. The book that opens the entire Bible, the book that defines where we come from, was written by a man who stood centuries away from the events he described. Skeptics have seen this as the crack in the foundation. They have said the text must be invention, myth, a story stitched together later by anonymous editors. But that is not what the evidence shows. The first hint comes from a man called Flávio Josefo, a historian of the 1st century after Christ, who simply assumed that Moses wrote Genesis. He did not argue it. He did not defend. He assumed it because in his time that was not even a question, but there is something deeper. The book itself carries an internal structure, a repeated formula that appears over and over like a signature. The word generations. It marks the literary unity of the text. The book was not assembled by a committee. It breathes as one voice. And the closer you look, the stranger the paradox becomes. How does one man know the exact words spoken when no one else was present? How does he know that the gold in Avila was good, that the onyx was there, that the bedelio lay under the soil? These are not the inventions of a storyteller. These are the details of a witness. But Moses was not a witness. So what was he? Livro que pesa como o mundo. When you open the first pages of Genesis, you are holding something immense. 50 chapters, 1,533 verses, enough to cover the entire arc of history from the first light to the death of Joseph in Egypt. Inside those pages are details no ordinary storyteller would invent. The river Pison flowing through a land called Havila, where gold is good, where bedelio and onyx wait under the soil. The pain of Rachel giving birth in the middle of a journey, naming her child with her last breath, the envy that ate Joseph's brothers alive until they sold him into a pit, the tears Joseph shed in secret when he saw them again. These are not vague legends. These are close-up, painful, human moments. They are moments you can feel in your chest, the kind of details only a witness would think to preserve. A woman in labor on the side of a road, the dust still on her clothes, her strength leaving her body as she calls out a name. A young man in a pit, his own brother sitting nearby eating bread, while he screams from the dark. A father who recognizes his son's torn cloak and believes the worst. These are not the inventions of a storyteller. They carry the weight of something lived. Here is the impossible part. Moses lived centuries after all of it. He was born in 1526 before Christ and died in 1393 before Christ. The flood was already thousands of years in the past. Abraham was a name whispered through centuries of family memory. Yet Genesis carries the texture of an eyewitness. That is the paradox in one sentence. How does a man who was not there know that the gold in Havilah was good? How does he know the exact words Rachel spoke in her final breath? If a person in our time tried to write the private conversations of a family from 2000 years ago without any records, everyone would call it fiction. But the world has never treated Genesis that way. Flavio Joseph, writing in the 1st century after Christ, simply assumed Moses wrote it. He did not defend the claim. He assumed it, because for him and for the entire ancient world, this was not a puzzle. It was established. And the book itself shows why. Look at the way it is built. The phrase "these are the generations" repeats throughout the text, like a drumbeat, marking each new section. The book has a spine. It has bones. It was not thrown together. Someone built it with intention. And the more you study that structure, the more one thing becomes clear. The writer of Genesis was not guessing. He was working from something solid. But what? The answer comes in 3 waves. And the first wave is the one that changes everything. A voz que falou, face a face. And now comes the first thing no one talks about. The Bible itself gives us the answer, and it does not hide it. In the book of Numbers, chapter 12, God himself explains the difference between Moses and every other prophet. Listen to this carefully. To other prophets, God said he would appear in visions and speak in dreams. But with Moses, God said he would speak mouth to mouth. Not in dreams, not in riddles, face to face. The Hebrew phrase is boca a boca. That is not poetry. That is a claim about direct revelation. It is God drawing a line in the sand and putting Moses on the other side of it, from every other prophet who ever lived. No visions in the night. No symbols that needed interpretation. Moses received words as clear as a man speaking to his friend. Now hold that thought, because the evidence is not only in what God said about Moses. It is in the words of Genesis itself. The language carries a technical precision that should not exist if the book were a patchwork of legends. In Hebrew, the word for create is varah. That word is used only with God as the subject. A human being never varah. A human being azah, which means to make or to form. And this technical vocabulary runs through all 50 chapters. The varah of creation appears when God is the one acting. The azah of human action appears when a person is doing the work. Over and over, consistently. Across a book that covers thousands of years and dozens of scenes. This is not the kind of consistency that happens by accident. It is the fingerprint of a single mind, and that mind was trained to speak about God precisely. And think about another detail. The phrase evening and morning that marks each day of creation follows the Hebrew way of counting days. The day begins at evening, when the sun goes down and the first stars appear. A foreign writer would not structure time that way. An Egyptian scribe would count from sunrise. A Babylonian would count from dawn, but Genesis counts from evening, because that is how the Hebrew people counted, from the moment God first spoke to them. The creation account was not borrowed from a pagan culture. It was revealed to a people and shaped for a people. Desacelere esse momento. The old man in the tent, the scroll before him, the pen in his hand, the oil lamp throwing shadows on the canvas walls, and the voice that knew the beginning because it was there. Moses did not write from memory alone. He wrote from the presence of God. The same God who said one thing in Numbers chapter 12. I speak with Moses mouth to mouth, openly and not in dark speeches. That is the first pillar. But it is not the only one. A cadeia que o tempo não quebrou. And then came the second thing, the family memory. Here is where the skeptics make their biggest mistake. They assume that writing was the only way to preserve a story across centuries. But the ancient world did not work that way. Oral tradition in the ancient Near East was not campfire gossip. It was disciplined, repeated, checked by elders, passed from father to son, with a precision that would put modern libraries to shame. A man who misremembered a genealogy in that world did not simply make an error. He broke a sacred trust. The stories were not entertainment. They were the family identity. They were the inheritance. They were the proof of who you were and what God had promised your fathers. And here is the part that will make your breath stop. The numbers. The book of Genesis gives us a genealogy, and when you do the math, something astonishing appears. Matusalem, the oldest man in the Bible, lived 243 years at the same time as Adam. 243 years. They could have sat together and spoken. Imagine that. Matusalem could have heard the story of the garden from the man who walked in it. He could have heard the sound of Adam's voice as he described what it felt like to breathe the air of a world that had never known death. He could have heard the silence that followed when Adam spoke the name of the tree. And then Matusalem could have turned and told someone else. And the chain does not stop. Sem, the son of Noah, lived 600 years. His life overlapped with Abraham for about 150 years. That means Abraham could have heard about the flood from a man whose father built the ark, not a distant legend. A conversation between two men who knew each other. One of them had smelled the wet wood of the ark. The other was the father of nations. The story of creation, the story of the garden, the story of the flood. None of it had to survive through thousands of years of broken telephone. It survived through a few overlapping human lives. Guarde esse número. Adam to Matusalem to Sem to Abraham to Joseph to Moses. The chain is short enough to touch. The Hebrew language even has a word for this kind of remembrance. Sikaron. Active remembrance, not nostalgia, not vague memory. A deliberate, disciplined act of carrying a story forward. A command and a calling at the same time. When Moses wrote about the flood, he was not inventing. He was writing down what his ancestors had preserved with their lives. Pense nisso. The memory refused to die because it was never allowed to die. These men did not pass stories casually. They passed them like fire, carefully, deliberately, because they believed that to forget was to lose a piece of God's own hand. And so the second pillar stands. But there is still a third, a assinatura escondida no barro. And now the third thing. This one hides in the structure of the text itself, and almost no one notices it. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. In 1936, a scholar named P.J. Wiseman made a discovery that reframes everything. In ancient Mesopotamia, scribes signed their clay tablets at the end. Not at the beginning, at the end. It was called a colophon, a closing signature that marked who owned the tablet and where the information came from. And Wiseman saw something that made him sit down slowly. The book of Genesis carries the same structure. 11 times, the phrase "these are the generations" appears. The Hebrew word is toledot, 11 times. Genesis chapter 5 verse 1, Genesis chapter 37 verse 2, Genesis chapter 6 verse 9. Over and over the same formula, and here is the detail that changes the game. These phrases do not open new sections, they close them. They read like signatures at the end of a block of text. In the ancient Near East, a tablet would be written, and at the bottom, the scribe would write whose record this was and when it ended. These are the generations of Adam, the closing line of a tablet. These are the generations of Noah, another tablet closed. These are the generations of Isaac,
another block preserved.
The word toledot is not a title. It is a seal. It is the ancient equivalent of a signature at the bottom of a page. And now the third piece clicks into place. Moses was raised in Egypt. The book of Acts, chapter 7, says he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He was trained as a scribe. He knew how to read and preserve ancient documents. He knew how to handle clay tablets and papyrus rolls. When Moses wrote Genesis, he did not sit down with a blank scroll and invent a story. He sat down with the documents his ancestors had preserved, and he edited them, arranged them, and carried them forward. The colophons show us the raw material. The face-to-face revelation shows us the authority. The family memory shows us the transmission. And the Egyptian training shows us the skill. 3 pillars. None of them are optional, but not everyone agreed. There is a theory that tried to tear all of this down, a teoria que nasceu da desconfiança. And now we face the man-made story that tried to bury all of it. It is called the documentary hypothesis. The letters J, E, G, P4 supposed anonymous sources that were stitched together centuries after Moses. The letter J for the source that used the name Yahweh. The letter E for the source that used the Elohim. The letter G for Deuteronomy. The letter P for the priestly material. The idea was born in universities in the modern era, not in ancient tradition. It began in the 18th and 19th centuries, when scholars looked at the Pentateuch and decided that Moses could not possibly have written it. The main evidence was something that seemed clever at first. The Bible uses different names for God. Elohim, Yahweh. Some passages use one, some passages use the other. The scholars said that proves multiple authors. They said the text was cut and pasted together by editors who lived centuries after the events. But think like a reader for a moment. If you read a book that uses God and Lord in different places, does that mean 2 authors wrote it? No. It means the author is using different titles for different purposes. Elohim emphasizes power, creation, the God above all. Yahweh emphasizes covenant, relationship, the God who makes promises and keeps them. The shift is not a seam between documents. It is a deliberate theological brushstroke. Judges use different titles for the same judge depending on the context. Writers use different names for the same person, depending on what they want you to feel. The divine names in Genesis are not evidence of fragmentation. They are evidence of care. And the documentary hypothesis has a deeper problem. It was built in the 19th century, before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1947, before the texts of Ugarit from the 2nd millennium, before Christ were unearthed, before archaeology transformed what we know about the ancient world. The more the spade digs into the ground, the more the hypothesis cracks. The texts of Ugarit alone prove that writing, poetry, legal codes, and religious literature existed in the 2nd millennium before Christ, exactly the period when the patriarchs lived. The Dead Sea Scrolls proved that ancient scribes preserved texts with obsessive precision over centuries. The documentary hypothesis assumes a world where nobody wrote things down, where oral tradition was unreliable, where ancient people were incapable of preserving history. But that is not the world that archaeology reveals. The skeptics built their theory on a modern prejudice. They thought ancient people were primitive. They were wrong, and there is more proof written in water, a água, que todos os povos lembram. Here is something that should make you sit very still. Long before the critics said Genesis was invented, other cultures carried the memory of a catastrophic flood. The Atrajasis epic, the Gilgamesh epic, both from Mesopotamia, both written in clay and stone, both centuries old by the time Moses was born. Both tell of a great flood that covered the world, a boat that saved a family, and gods who sent the waters. Gilgamesh was a king who went searching for the survivor of the flood to learn the secret of eternal life. Atrajasis was a man who built a boat and loaded it with animals while the gods wept at what they had done. And these are not the only ones. Flood stories appear in distant cultures, separated by oceans, carried by peoples who never spoke to one another. The Greeks remembered Deucalion and Pyrrha, who escaped the waters in a chest. The Hopi remembered a world destroyed by water. The Maasai in Africa told of a flood that washed everything away. The Chinese recorded a great flood that covered the mountains. The pattern repeats so often that the question is not whether the flood happened. The question is when and how. A shared catastrophe leaves a shared scar. When a real event is terrible enough, every survivor tells a version of it, and the versions drift over centuries like dust in the wind. But Genesis does not read like a drifting legend. It reads like the original record. It is specific where the pagan stories are vague. One God, not a quarrelsome pantheon. One family, not a royal dynasty. One ark with dimensions that keep the boat stable in violent water. 7 pairs of clean animals, 1 pair of the others. 40 days and 40 nights of rain. The other accounts are fever dreams compared to the calm precision of Genesis. They describe gods who flood the earth because humans are too noisy. Genesis describes Blasi God, who judges a world that has filled itself with violence. The difference is not only in detail, it is in character. Why does that matter? Because it means the Bible's account was not borrowed from Babylonian campfire stories. It was preserved through the same chain of overlapping lives we already traced. The flood was real, the memory was real, and the record was kept by people who believed that remembering accurately was holy. Desacelere esse momento. Think of what that means. The same disciplined transmission that kept the flood story alive also kept the creation story alive. The same refusal to let the past die. The same hands carrying the same fire, and now that chain reaches all the way to you. Que isso faz com a sua vida? Here is where this story turns toward you. Because if Genesis is reliable, then life has a purpose. You were not thrown into existence by a cosmic accident. You were not a random arrangement of atoms that learned to think. You came from somewhere. The same God who spoke to Moses face to face, the same God who called the light into being, the same God who carried the memory of the flood through the centuries is the God who put you here. And if Genesis is reliable, then the question is not whether your life means something. The question is whether you know the one who gave it meaning. Jesus himself said in the Gospel of John, chapter 5, that if you believed Moses, you would believe him, because Moses wrote about him. That is the connection. Jesus did not treat Genesis as a myth. He treated it as the record of a real God doing real things. He said, If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. That sentence only makes sense if Moses actually wrote. And if Moses actually wrote, the origin story you carry in your hands is true. The book of Genesis is not a dusty ancient document. It is the opening chapter of your own story. Every person you have ever loved, every night you have lain awake asking what it all means, every dawn that pulled you back from despair. All of it traces back to the same origin. You are not an accident. You are part of a plan. And the fact that Moses wrote it all down, preserved through revelation, memory, and training, tells you something about the God who authored it. He does not abandon his story. He carries it forward. He carries you forward. The same God who counted the stars with Abraham has counted the hairs on your head. The same God who spoke to Moses in a tent speaks to you in the silence. You were not written into this story by mistake. Your name is in the margin of the same book. Agora respire. Let this land, because the same hands that guarded the story through centuries are the hands that guard you tonight. And that leads us to the final piece, os três pilares que sustentam o começo. And now we come to the final piece. The three explanations are not rivals. They are not three guesses where one might be right and the other two might be wrong. They are three pillars under one book. God spoke to Moses face to face. That is the first pillar. The family memory carried the story from Adam, through Matusalem, through Sem, through Abraham, through Joseph, all the way to Moses. That is the second pillar. And the Egyptian scribal training gave Moses the technical skill to read, preserve, and arrange the ancient documents. That is the third pillar. Take any one of them away, and the book falls. But together, they hold. And that is the point the skeptics never considered. They wanted to choose one explanation and kill the others. It was just revelation. It was just an oral tradition. It was just editing. But the truth is richer than their suspicion. God used education. God used family. God used memory. He did not wipe Moses' mind and pour the text in by magic. He worked through a man who was prepared. Acts chapter 7 tells us, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in words and deeds. That education was not an obstacle to God. It was a tool in God's hand. The same is true for you. Your losses, your training, your family, your memory, none of it is wasted. God uses what he prepares, and he prepared Moses for exactly this task. The man who stood in Pharaoh's court, as a prince learned to read and write in the most advanced civilization of his age. The man who spent 40 years in Midian tending sheep learned patience and silence. The man who met God at a burning bush, and that the ground he stood on was holy. All of it went into the writing of Genesis. The revelation, the memory, the training. Not one strand wasted, not one piece accidental. Now, if this found you tonight, there is a prayer worth praying. Close your eyes if you can. And say this with me. God, you spoke to Moses face to face. Speak to me now. You carried the story through centuries. Carry my story too. You prepared a man to write. Prepare me for what you have for me. Let those words sit with you. They are short enough to remember, long enough to hold. If this found you tonight, you are not here by accident. You found this story for a reason. If you want to keep walking through these ancient pages, subscribe to this channel and walk with us. And here is a question. The story itself leaves open. Moses wrote about creation, about the flood, about Abraham. But there is another book of Moses that gets even less attention. The book of Job. Who wrote it? And why does it read like a man who had seen too much? That story is for another night. But for now, hold on to what you heard. 3 pillars, 1 book,